By the morning of October 25, 1944, over 1,000 American sailors would be dead in the waters east of a Philippine island most Americans had never heard of. Their ships had no business fighting the enemy that had cornered them. They were escort carriers, destroyers, thin-hulled vessels built to hunt submarines and cover landings, not to trade fire with battleships. Their commanding officer, on the bridge of his flagship that morning, was drinking coffee when the pagoda masts of the Imperial Japanese Navy rose over the horizon. They were there because 3 months earlier, in a stateroom aboard a heavy cruiser tied up at Pearl Harbor, 3 men had sat down over a map of the Pacific and made a compromise. A dying president, a general who had made a promise he intended to keep at any cost, and an admiral who quietly refused to hand him the fleet that could keep it. This is the story of that compromise, and of the men who paid for it at dawn on a gray sea off an island called Samar, Pearl Harbor. The 26th of July, 1944, the heavy cruiser USS Baltimore rides at her mooring. Sailors line the rails in dress whites. On her deck, 3 men will shortly be photographed together for the first and only time in the war. In the center, seated in a wooden chair, is the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 62 years old, paralyzed from the waist down for 23 years. He is exhausted, he is dying, though the American public does not yet know it. In 9 months, he will be gone. On his left, when he arrives, will stand General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific Area, the most famous soldier in America, and, if he chooses to be, the President's most dangerous political rival. On the President's right, in a plain khaki uniform without decoration, is Admiral Chester William Nimitz, 59 years old, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Ocean areas. He commands 2,000 ships, 15,000 aircraft, and over 2 million men. Standing behind them, watching quietly, is Admiral William Leahy, 69 years old, the President's Chief of Staff. There is no verbatim transcript of what these men will say to each other over the next 2 nights. But by the end of the week, the shape of the final year of the Pacific War will be decided, and the fate of the fleet Nimitz commands and MacArthur wants will be sealed. To understand the argument aboard the Baltimore, we have to go back further, to the 30th of March, 1942, 3 months after Pearl Harbor. The Japanese hold the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. They are landing in New Guinea. Their submarines prowl the coast of California. American commanders in Washington need to decide who will lead the counterattack. There are 2 candidates: General Douglas MacArthur, just rescued from the Philippines, and Admiral Chester Nimitz, 3 months into his command at Pearl Harbor. The United States Army and the United States Navy cannot agree. The Navy, led by Admiral Ernest King, will not allow an Army general to command the Pacific Fleet. King is 65 years old, iron-willed, and famously difficult. He believes that carriers and battleships are naval instruments, naval doctrine, naval tradition, naval officers, not toys for ground commanders. The Army will not accept a naval officer commanding land campaigns across half the world. The Joint Chiefs of Staff try for weeks to broker a single unified command. They fail. On the 30th of March, 1942, they announce a compromise no professional soldier or sailor would have designed on purpose. The Pacific is cut in 2. MacArthur receives the Southwest Pacific area, Australia, New Guinea, the Solomons, the Bismarck Archipelago, the Philippines. Nimitz receives the Pacific Ocean areas. Everything else, the Central Pacific, the North Pacific, the vast blue emptiness where the great naval war will be fought. Neither man reports to the other. They both report to Washington. They command side by side, but separately. Here is the first strange truth of this story. That decision was not a strategy. It was not a plan. It was a political compromise between 2 branches of the American armed forces that could not agree who was in charge. It was born of institutional rivalry, not of any considered judgment about how to defeat Japan. For the next 28 months, 2 American commanders will fight the largest ocean war in history along 2 separate axes with 2 chains of command, competing quietly for ships, men, aircraft and priority, and nowhere in the system will there be anyone with the authority to tell either of them to stop. Not until July of 1944, when a dying president will fly to Hawaii to try. Chester William Nimitz was born on the 24th of February 1885 in a small town called Fredericksburg, deep in the German hill country of central Texas. His father had died 6 months before he was born of rheumatic fever at the age of 29. His mother, Anna Josephine Henke, would marry her late husband's younger brother 5 years later. The boy grew up in a household of German immigrants, in a town where the newspapers were still printed in German, and where the tallest building was a steamboat-shaped hotel run by his grandfather. The grandfather was Charles Henry Nimitz, a former seaman in the German Merchant Marine, a Texas Ranger, a Confederate officer during the Civil War. He had never forgotten the sea. He would sit young Chester on the porch of the hotel and tell him about oceans the boy had never seen. And once, when the boy was troubled, the grandfather told him something the admiral would remember for the rest of his life. The sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster. The best way to get along with either is to learn all you can. Then do your best, and do not worry, especially things over which you have no control. The boy applied to West Point. There was no vacancy. He applied to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. He was accepted. He graduated in 1905, 7th in a class of 114. For the next 36 years, he did the work of the Navy quietly. He studied diesel engines in Germany and Belgium. He built the first submarine base at Pearl Harbor. He invented the techniques that would allow American fleets to refuel at sea and stay on station for months without returning to port. When Franklin Roosevelt asked him to take command at Pearl Harbor after the Japanese attack, Nimitz was 56 years old and running the Navy's Bureau of Navigation from a desk in Washington. He arrived at Pearl Harbor on Christmas Day, 1941. 6 days later, on the 31st of December, he formally assumed command. The ceremony took place on the deck of a submarine, USS Grayling, because there was no battleship afloat in the harbor still capable of hosting one. The great warships lay in the mud around him. Oil still leaked from the Arizona. Nimitz was not a showman. He gave no speeches. He wore plain khakis without decoration. At his headquarters on the shoulder of MacArthur's Hill, above Pearl Harbor, he kept a pet goat named Billy that wandered through the offices, and on at least one occasion ate a stack of official correspondence off a desk. He hosted horseshoe tournaments in the afternoons. He walked the grounds every morning. He listened more than he spoke. But when he made a decision, he did not reverse it. And when the time came in the summer of 1944 that he was told the Pacific Fleet was going to be handed to an army general, he did not shout, and he did not argue, and he did not resign. He simply, quietly refused. 1,500 miles to the south, in the summer of 1944, another American commander was preparing his own return. Douglas MacArthur had been born on the 26th of January 1880 at an army barracks in Little Rock, Arkansas. His father, Arthur MacArthur Jr., had won the Medal of Honor at the Battle of Missionary Ridge in the Civil War at the age of 18. His mother, Mary Pinckney Hardy, would follow him to West Point and take an apartment overlooking his dormitory window to watch him study. He graduated first in his class of 93 cadets in 1903. By 1930, he was Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He was one of the most decorated officers in American history, and he was, at 64 years old in the summer of 1944, easily the most theatrical. He wore a battered field marshal's cap. He clenched a corncob pipe. He referred to himself in the third person. He wrote his own communiques and released them to the American press in prose that borrowed heavily from the King James Bible. In December of 1941, he was Commanding General of United States and Forces in the Far East, headquartered in Manila. Word of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor reached his headquarters within an hour of its beginning. He had, by the standards of any modern military doctrine, ample warning. His war plan required immediate action. His air commander, General Louis Brereton, requested permission to strike Japanese airfields on Formosa preemptively. MacArthur delayed the decisions his air commander had urged him to make. 8.5 hours later, Japanese bombers from Formosa arrived over Clark Field in perfect weather. They found the American Far East Air Force lined up on the runways in neat rows. In a single afternoon, they destroyed nearly 100 aircraft on the ground, including most of the modern B-17 bombers meant to defend the archipelago. Here is the second strange truth of this story. The man who would spend the next 3 years demanding the Pacific Fleet be handed to him so he could return to the Philippines was the same man who had lost the Philippines in a single afternoon to an air attack he had been warned about and had failed to prevent. In his memoirs, written 2 decades later, he would mention Clark Field only to blame others. 4 months later, on the night of the 11th of March, 1942, he boarded a small wooden torpedo boat, PT-41, at the dock on Corregidor. He carried his wife Jean, his 4-year-old son Arthur, a Chinese ama named Ashu, and a handful of senior staff officers. He left behind 76,000 American and Filipino troops who would soon surrender to the Japanese and die on the Bataan Death March. Days later, at a small railway station in South Australia called Terowie, he faced a crowd of reporters and spoke one sentence: "I came through, and I shall return." For the rest of the war, that promise would drive him, and it would nearly cost the United States Navy its greatest disaster since Pearl Harbor. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was 62 years old in the summer of 1944, and he was running for a 4th term as President of the United States. No man had ever done it before. No man would ever do it again. He was also, though the American public did not know it, dying. His blood pressure was uncontrollable. His heart was failing. His personal physician had told him privately that he might not survive another year in office. He would not, in fact, survive 9 months, but before he died, he had a war to finish and a political problem to solve. That problem's name was Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was not merely a general, he was a national symbol. He had been the face of American resistance in the Pacific for 2.5 years. His press office in Brisbane had issued hundreds of communiques over the course of the war, and the general's own name appeared in nearly every one. Conservative Republicans had noticed. Since 1943, they had been quietly floating his name as a possible presidential candidate. A movement had begun. MacArthur had not discouraged it. In early 1944, he had allowed his name to be entered in the Wisconsin Republican primary. He had lost, but the possibility remained. If Roosevelt appeared to sideline the man who had promised to liberate the Philippines in an election year, the political consequences could be severe. At the same time, Roosevelt could not simply give MacArthur what he wanted, because what MacArthur wanted was the United States Pacific Fleet, every carrier, every fast battleship, every amphibious force trained for the invasion of Japan, redirected to serve one objective: his return. The Navy, backed by Admiral King in Washington and Nimitz at Pearl, had a different plan: bypass the Philippines entirely. Take Formosa, cut Japan off from the oil and rubber and rice of Southeast Asia. Starve the empire into surrender without ever setting foot in Manila. 2 strategies, 2 theaters, 2 commanders who had barely spoken to each other in 28 months, except through cables to Washington. Here is the third strange truth of this story. On the 21st of July, 1944, 6 days before the conference at Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt was formally nominated for a 4th term at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. 4 days later, he boarded the USS Baltimore and sailed for Hawaii. He did not, strictly speaking, need to go. The Joint Chiefs could have decided Pacific strategy in Washington, as they had decided every other strategic question of the war. He did not need to fly out and sit between his 2 theater commanders in person. Admiral Leahy, watching the whole trip unfold, would later write that Roosevelt made no formal strategic decisions in Hawaii at all. He listened, he smiled, he was photographed. The most powerful reason for the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy to sail halfway across the ocean in the middle of a world war was not, in the end, military. It was to be photographed standing next to Douglas MacArthur, so that when the general returned to the United States after the war, no American voter would ever be able to say the president had ignored him. Roosevelt was a very good politician, and on the evening of the 26th of July, 1944, in the stateroom of a heavy cruiser tied up at Pearl Harbor, he sat down between the two most powerful commanders of the Pacific War to hear their arguments. MacArthur spoke first. "Before we return to that stateroom aboard the Baltimore, we have to travel 4 months back, to a different room, to the first and only time these two men had ever met face to face, Brisbane, Australia, the 25th of March, 1944. MacArthur's headquarters occupied a 9-story office building on Queen Street in the center of the city. It had once belonged to an insurance company. It had large windows and long corridors, and on the top floors, the general's private offices, where he paced continuously, sometimes for hours at a time, a corncob pipe clenched in his teeth, dictating memoranda to a stenographer who followed him from wall to wall. On the morning of the 25th, a small, unmarked American aircraft touched down at Amberley Field outside the city. Down the steps in plain khakis and a soft-brimmed cap came Chester Nimitz. The two men were the same military rank. They had been fighting the same war against the same enemy for over 2 years. They had never once been in the same room. Not at Pearl Harbor, not in Washington, not at any of the Allied strategy conferences at Cairo, Casablanca, or Quebec. They had directed a combined operation across 10,000 miles of ocean by cable and courier. They had never shaken hands. MacArthur greeted Nimitz warmly. He had the manner, when he chose, of a 19th-century Southern gentleman. He led the admiral through the corridors of the Queen Street building, past maps of New Guinea and the Bismarcks, past officers who stood at attention as they passed. Nimitz was polite. He asked questions, he listened. For 3 days, the two men worked over their common front, the strategy for the coming spring, the neutralization of Rabaul, the advance along the northern coast of New Guinea. Everything was, in Nimitz's own words in a later report to Admiral King, lovely and harmonious, until the last day. On the last day, Nimitz raised the matter of a directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff that had crossed his desk in Washington. The directive instructed both theater commanders to prepare alternate plans, faster plans, shorter routes, plans that would move directly toward what the Joint Chiefs called the Luzon-Formosa-China Triangle if Japanese resistance appeared to be weakening. The directive contained one specific phrase that Nimitz repeated quietly to MacArthur. Bypass the Philippines. The room went still. The general, who had been all Southern charm for 3 days, transformed. He stood up, he began to pace. He did not shout, he did not raise his voice, but he began in the cadence he used for public speeches, an oration. He spoke of the Philippines. He spoke of the 17 million Filipinos suffering under Japanese occupation. He spoke of American prisoners starving in Japanese camps. He spoke of Bataan. He spoke of Corregidor. He spoke of his promise. He spoke of blood on America's soul. He spoke for the better part of an hour. Nimitz, according to his own report, listened without interrupting. He did not argue. He did not defend the directive. He did not tell the general that the directive had come from the Joint Chiefs, or that Admiral King in Washington had drafted it, or that the President of the United States would ultimately have to decide whether to enforce it. When MacArthur finally stopped, Nimitz thanked him for his hospitality and left. He wrote his report on the flight back to Pearl Harbor. He sent it to Admiral King. King filed it away. 4 months later, he would use it to prepare Nimitz for a very different conversation, in a very different room, with the President of the United States sitting between them. The two most powerful commanders in the Pacific War had met for the first time, and they had discovered that on the largest question in the war, they did not agree at all. Between the meeting in Brisbane and the meeting at Pearl Harbor, one further event changed the equation. It happened in June of 1944, in the waters off the Mariana Islands. For 18 months, the United States Navy had been building new Essex-class fleet carriers, faster and larger than anything Japan could match. new Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls, new Iowa-class battleships, the fastest heavy warships in the world, new destroyers, cruisers, submarines, transports, oilers, escort carriers. In the spring of 1944, all of that new steel began to reach the Pacific, and on the 19th and 20th of June, off the island of Saipan, the Japanese carrier fleet made the mistake of trying to fight it in the open sea. The battle would be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's fast carrier task force, operating under Admiral Raymond Spruance, launched hundreds of American fighters into the path of incoming Japanese airstrikes. In a single day, American pilots shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft for the loss of 30 of their own. American submarines sank 2 Japanese fleet carriers, the Shokaku and the Taiho, Ozawa's own flagship, torpedoed by USS Albacore and destroyed by internal explosions hours later. By the end of the second day, Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting arm was finished. The pilots were dead. The airframes were on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The battle was fought entirely in Nimitz's Central Pacific. Not one of MacArthur's ships was present. When word of the victory reached Brisbane, MacArthur said little in public. In private, according to staff officers who worked with him, his mood darkened for weeks. The Central Pacific route he had spent 2 years arguing against had just produced the largest naval victory of the war. The strategy he wanted the president to reject had just destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy's ability to defend its home islands. And in less than a month, he would have to sit in front of Franklin Roosevelt and argue that the Pacific Fleet should be handed to him. Pearl Harbor. The evening of the 26th of July, 1944, the USS Baltimore had entered the harbor that afternoon. Sailors in whites had lined the rails. President Roosevelt, in a wheelchair he did not permit to be photographed, was carried aboard the flagship and settled into a stateroom on the second deck. Nimitz had come out to meet the ship. He had been at the dock in a plain staff car. MacArthur had not. For a full hour after the president's arrival, no one knew where the general was. Officers of the Baltimore's crew waited at attention. Roosevelt sat in the stateroom, sipping a drink. Nimitz waited quietly in a folding chair on deck. At last, from the direction of Hickam Field, came the sound of motorcycles. A convoy appeared on the road along the harbor. At its head, a long open limousine with the top folded back. Standing in the rear seat, one hand on the frame of the windshield, was Douglas MacArthur. He wore a leather flight jacket, unbuttoned over his khaki uniform. He wore his field marshal's cap. He waved slowly, ceremonially, to crowds who had come out along the road to see him. He had not asked permission to make an entrance. He had simply chosen to make one. He had, according to officers who accompanied him, been furious about the entire trip. He had called it a picture-taking junket. He had complained bitterly that in the First World War he had never left his division, not even when he was wounded by gas. Now, he said, he was being forced to turn his back on his troops for a photograph in Hawaii. But now that he had arrived, he intended to be seen. He came aboard the Baltimore, saluted the president with theatrical precision, and shook Nimitz's hand as if they were old friends. They were not old friends. They had met exactly once in their lives, 4 months earlier, across a conference table in Brisbane, where MacArthur had refused to consider what Nimitz had come to say. Dinner was served in the wardroom. Photographs were taken on the fantail. Roosevelt, in a lightweight suit and open collar, smiled between the two commanders. Leahy stood behind them. The sun set over the harbor. And after dinner, the 3 men who mattered adjourned to a smaller stateroom, where a large map of the Pacific had been mounted on an easel. There is no verbatim record of what was said in that room over the next 2 evenings. There is only what the participants later remembered and what they later wrote. MacArthur spoke first, and he spoke at length. He did not begin with maps or logistics. He began with what he called the moral obligation of the American nation. 17 million Filipinos, he said, were living under Japanese occupation. Thousands of American prisoners of war, survivors of Bataan, were dying in Japanese camps. The Philippines were American territory. The United States had a constitutional duty to liberate them. To bypass the Philippines, he said, was to leave blood on the soul of America. He spoke without notes for nearly an hour. He gestured at the map. He named provinces and islands. He described terrain he had walked as a young lieutenant 40 years before. He was, by every account, magnificent. He was also, by every account, doing what he did best. He was arguing a case in front of a jury of exactly one man. He did not mention certain things. He did not mention that his plan would require the entire Third Fleet to operate under his strategic direction. He did not mention that a campaign across the Philippine archipelago would take months, possibly a full year, and cost tens of thousands of American lives. He did not mention that Formosa lay closer to the Japanese home islands than Luzon. He did not mention his own responsibility for Clark Field. When MacArthur was finished, Nimitz took the floor. He spoke quietly. He did not gesture. He referred to the map only when he needed to point out a specific position. He presented the case for Formosa. Formosa lay closer to Japan than the Philippines. Seizing it would sever Japanese sea lanes to Southeast Asia more efficiently than any campaign in the archipelago. It would open a direct connection to mainland China, where American submarines and aircraft could resupply Chinese forces still fighting the Japanese army. It would place American bombers within closer range of Japanese cities. And critically, it would not require the Navy to hand its strategic direction to an Army general who had never commanded a naval action. He did not say the last part in those words, but every man in the room understood it. Here is a truth that historians would only fully acknowledge decades later. The plan Nimitz was presenting was not, in his own private view, the strongest plan. It was Admiral King's plan. Nimitz had been ordered to present it. Admiral Raymond Spruance, one of the most respected commanders in the Navy, had privately argued for exactly the strategy MacArthur was now proposing. Invade the Philippines, then Okinawa, then Japan. MacArthur, watching Nimitz across the table, sensed it. He would later write in his memoirs a single sentence about that night. Admiral Nimitz, he wrote, put forth the Navy plan. But I was sure it was King's and not his own. He was right, but he was wrong about the deeper truth of the room. Because whatever Nimitz's private view of Formosa or Luzon, on one point he was absolute. The Pacific Fleet would not be handed to MacArthur. It would remain under naval command. The carriers, the fast battleships, the amphibious forces trained by Marines would answer to Nimitz and to King in Washington, and to the President of the United States. They would not answer to a general. The argument went on for 2 nights. Roosevelt, according to Leahy, was entirely neutral. He asked polite questions. He allowed each man to speak without interruption. He made no decisions in the room. On the morning of the 20th of July, he sailed for Alaska. Both commanders returned to their headquarters, MacArthur to the Southwest Pacific, Nimitz to Pearl Harbor. 12 days later, on the 9th of August, MacArthur received a personal letter from the president. Roosevelt wrote that upon returning to Washington, he would push forward with the plan the general had recommended. The Philippines, MacArthur believed, and he probably was right, that Roosevelt had sided with him for reasons that had nothing to do with strategy. It was an election year. The general's conservative supporters were watching, and the president did not intend to be photographed as the man who had rejected the promise to return. But Roosevelt had not given MacArthur everything he wanted. The Third Fleet, under Admiral William Halsey, would support the Philippines campaign, but it would remain under Nimitz's command at Pearl Harbor. Halsey would report to Nimitz, Nimitz would report to King. King would report to the Joint Chiefs and the President. MacArthur would have his own naval force, the Seventh Fleet, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, 6 old battleships raised from the mud of Pearl Harbor, 18 escort carriers, small and slow, organized into 3 task groups called Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and Taffy 3, a screen of destroyers. It was enough force to land troops on beaches and cover them once ashore. It was not enough force to fight a fleet action. 2 fleets, 2 chains of command, 2 admirals reporting to 2 different superiors. It was a compromise designed to satisfy everyone. and it would create a seam in the American position that the Imperial Japanese Navy, in its dying weeks, would find and exploit, and nearly split open. There was one more decision, and it was MacArthur's alone, and it would matter more than any other order given in the summer of 1944. MacArthur ruled that 3rd Fleet and 7th Fleet were not to communicate directly by radio. All operational messages between them would be routed through a Navy relay station on Manus Island in the Admiralty Group, some 1,500 miles southeast of the Philippines. The stated reason was security. Radio traffic between two fleets could be intercepted by the Japanese and used to plot their positions. Routing everything through Manus on a delay would keep the enemy in the dark. The unstated reason was command jealousy. If Halsey and Kinkaid could talk directly, then Halsey, senior in rank, might begin to give orders to Kinkaid, and Kinkaid answered to MacArthur. Not to Halsey, not to Nimitz. MacArthur was determined that no naval officer of any rank would ever give an order to a subordinate of his without going through him first. The Manus relay would add hours to every message. In an operation involving hundreds of ships and hundreds of thousands of men in a fast-moving surface battle where minutes decided the fate of task forces, a delay of 2 hours could be catastrophic. No one raised the alarm. The order stood. While the Americans built their compromise in Tokyo, the Imperial Japanese Navy prepared its last card. Admiral Somu Toyoda, 59 years old, commanded what remained of the combined fleet from a headquarters in Hiyoshi on the outskirts of Yokohama. He had watched, in the Marianas, the end of Japanese carrier aviation as a fighting arm. He knew he could not fight the Americans in the open ocean again. He also knew that if the Philippines fell, the sea lanes to Southeast Asia would be cut and the empire would starve. He had one battle left in him. The plan was called Shogo 1, Operation Victory No. 1. It was built on a single insight that Toyoda's staff had extracted from months of studying American operations. The Americans had split their fleet between two command structures that did not coordinate directly. Shugo 1 called for the last strong surface forces of the Japanese Navy to converge on Leyte Gulf from 3 directions simultaneously. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, 55 years old, would command the center force. 5 battleships, including the 2 largest warships ever built, Yamato and Musashi, each mounting 9 18-inch guns. 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. He would sail from Brunei, pass north of Palawan, cross the Sibuyan Sea, and emerge from the San Bernardino Strait onto the eastern side of the Philippines. Then he would turn south and fall on the American landing beaches. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, 54 years old, would command the southern force. 2 old battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 4 destroyers. He would enter Leyte Gulf from the south through the Surigao Strait. He knew, and his officers knew, that he was almost certainly not going to survive the passage. He accepted the mission without complaint. And in the north, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 57 years old, would command the decoy. 1 fleet carrier, Zuikaku, and 3 light carriers, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda, carrying fewer than half their normal air complement. 2 hybrid battleship carriers, Ise and Hyuga, with partial flight decks aft. Cruisers and destroyers. Ozawa's mission was to be seen. He was to sail south from Japan, position himself so that American reconnaissance would spot him, and offer himself as bait. The Americans, he was told, would not be able to resist the sight of Japanese aircraft carriers within striking range. They would come for him, and when they did, they would leave the San Bernardino Strait unguarded, and Kurita would slip through, undetected, and fall on MacArthur's transports. Ozawa knew he was leading his ships to their destruction. He accepted the order the same way Nishimura had. Here is the truth that would only become clear later. The Japanese plan, absurd and desperate as it was built on a single accurate reading of American command structure. Toyoda's staff had understood, better than most American officers, what MacArthur's compromise at Pearl Harbor had created. The Americans had 2 fleets that could not talk to each other. The Japanese would attack the seam. By the middle of October, the American invasion force was assembling east of the Philippines. Over 700 ships, 130,000 men of General Walter Kruger's Sixth Army, waiting in their transports. On the 20th of October, 1944, the landing craft turned toward the beaches of Leyte, and a heavy cruiser named Nashville stood off the coast, and General Douglas MacArthur, in a fresh khaki uniform and his gold-braided cap, boarded a landing craft and rowed toward the shore he had left in the darkness 2 years and 7 months before. He waded through the surf. He walked up the beach. He turned to a radio microphone that had been placed at the edge of the sand. He spoke the 4 words he had rehearsed for 2.5 years. 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral William Halsey was aboard the battleship New Jersey, receiving the first reconnaissance reports of Japanese warships putting to sea. Kurita's center force had already been spotted west of Palawan. 2 American submarines were closing in. The battle that would decide whether MacArthur's promise had been kept or had killed the fleet that made it possible was about to begin. And in Pearl Harbor, in a quiet office on the shoulder of Macalapa Hill, Chester Nimitz sat at his desk with a stack of intercepts in front of him, watching a system he had warned about begin, slowly, to come apart. Dawn, the 25th of October, 1944. Off the eastern coast of the island of Samar, the sea was grey, low overcast, occasional rain squalls, visibility roughly 20 miles. 6 small escort carriers were steaming in a loose circle, launching a routine anti-submarine patrol. Around them, a screen of 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts. The ships were slow, thin-hulled, unarmored. They had been built on merchant hulls in California shipyards and sent out to the Pacific to fly anti-submarine planes and support ground operations. They were never meant to fight a surface action against anything larger than a submarine. The task unit's official designation was Task Unit 77. 4-3. Its call sign was Taffy 3. It was commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, 48 years old, reserved. Deliberate. His crews called him Ziggy. On the bridge of his flagship, Fanshawe Bay, he was drinking coffee. At 6:37 in the morning, a radioman on Fanshawe Bay intercepted a stray Japanese transmission from somewhere to the north. 6 minutes later, an American pilot on patrol reported a surface force. 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, 11 destroyers, 20 miles away and closing at high speed. Sprague on the bridge waved the report away. It had to be part of Halsey's fleet. Halsey was north, it was Halsey. Then the horizon changed. Above the sea in the northern quadrant rose the outlines of pagoda masts, tall, tiered, unmistakable. Not American, Japanese. And at the head of the line, dwarfing everything around it, the silhouette of a ship larger than any warship afloat. The battleship Yamato, 9 18-inch guns, over 70,000 tons. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita on her bridge. Kurita had come through the San Bernardino Strait during the night, unopposed, undetected, and he had turned south along the coast of Samar with the entire center force intact. There was nothing between him and the American transports in Leyte Gulf but Taffy 3. Sprague did what any American commander does when he has no good options. He sent the emergency signal. Enemy battleships. Immediate assistance required. He turned his carriers east into the wind and launched every aircraft he had. He ordered his destroyers to attack. 300 miles to the north, Admiral Halsey was pursuing Ozawa's decoy carriers with every fast ship in the Third Fleet. 6 modern battleships, 11 aircraft carriers, every cruiser and destroyer that could keep up. Task Force 30 Group, that Kincaid and Nimitz both believed was guarding the San Bernardino Strait, was not there. It had never been formed. Halsey had taken the battleships north with him. The strait was empty. Sprague's distress call was routed through the relay station at Manus per MacArthur's order. It sat there for over 2 hours before it reached Halsey. By the time Halsey read it, the fight was already an hour old. Aboard the destroyer USS Johnston, Commander Ernest E. Evans stood on his bridge. 36 years old, Cherokee on his father's side, Creek on his mother's, from Pawnee, Oklahoma. He had, at his ship's commissioning a year earlier, addressed his crew with a single sentence that they had never forgotten. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way." Now, on the morning of the 25th of October, harm's way had come to him. He did not wait for orders. He turned Johnston toward the Japanese line and rang up flank speed. A single destroyer, just over 2,000 tons, 5-inch guns. Charging directly at 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, he closed to torpedo range under a rain of shells that threw water higher than his mast. He fired 10 torpedoes. One of them tore open the bow of the heavy cruiser Kumano, knocking her out of the fight. He turned away, was straddled repeatedly, took a 14-inch shell through his engine room, lost half his power, half his guns, and most of his bridge crew. Then he turned back into the line and continued firing what guns he had left. Behind him, the destroyer Hull and the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts followed him in. Both would sink within the hour. The escort carrier Gambier Bay, hit repeatedly by cruiser fire, would go down. She would be the only American aircraft carrier of the entire war sunk by naval gunfire. Johnston fought for over 2 hours before her engines finally stopped and Japanese destroyers closed in and finished her. Ernest Evans went into the water with his crew. He was never seen again. At Pearl Harbor, in the operations room on Macalapa Hill, Chester Nimitz stood over a chart and listened as intercepts from Taffy 3 came in. 8:22. Fast battleships urgently needed immediately at Leyte Gulf. 9:05. Need fast battleships and air support. 9:07. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers attack our escort carriers. Nimitz sat down at a desk. He dictated a single message to Halsey. It was encrypted per Navy standard practice, with padding phrases at the beginning and end to defeat Japanese cryptanalysts. The message read, "Turkey trots to water, from Sinpak to Commander 3rd Fleet. Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." The last 3 words were padding. They meant nothing. They were random filler. When the message reached Halsey's flagship, the communications officer failed to strip the padding. Halsey read the message as written. "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." He tore off his cap. He threw it on the deck. He cursed. His chief of staff had to physically walk him to his sea cabin. It was the most famous message of the Pacific War, and it was from beginning to end a random accident of naval encryption procedure. By 9:20 in the morning, Kurita, on the bridge of Yamato, had lost his nerve. His rangefinders reported the American escort carriers making 30 knots. They could barely make 18. His officers insisted the American destroyers were heavy cruisers. His scout planes were gone. The air attacks were relentless, coming from every direction. He was, in his mind, being torn apart by the whole of the 3rd Fleet. He had been at sea for 3 straight days under continuous attack. His flagship, the heavy cruiser Atago, had been torpedoed and sunk under him on the 23rd. He had swum for his life in an oil-black sea. He had transferred his flag to Yamato exhausted and half-blind with fatigue. At 9:25, he gave the order. "Rendezvous. My course north. Speed 20. He turned away. He was at that moment less than a day's steaming from the American transports in Leyte Gulf. Between him and the beachhead lay only the 6 old battleships of Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, refueling in Surigao Strait after the night action against Nishimura, low on armor-piercing ammunition, but not yet defeated. Historians would argue for the rest of the century about what would have happened if Kurita had pressed on. He did not press on. He turned away. Taffy 3 had held, at the cost of the destroyers Johnston and Hull, the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, the escort carrier Gambier Bay, and, later that afternoon, the escort carrier St. Lo, struck by the first organized kamikaze attack of the war. Over 1,000 American sailors died in the deep waters east of Samar. Nimitz would write afterward that their survival was, in his exact words, nothing short of special dispensation from the Lord Almighty. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, 11 destroyers, over 10,000 Japanese sailors. The ships that survived limped home to Japanese ports and, for the most part, never sailed again. In December of 1944, Chester Nimitz was promoted to the newly created rank of Fleet Admiral. 5 stars. That same month, Douglas MacArthur was promoted to General of the Army. 5 stars. They now held equal rank as they had held equal command throughout the war. MacArthur's campaign across the Philippines continued for the next 10 months. It cost over 10,000 American lives and 36,000 wounded. Some historians have argued that many of those casualties were unnecessary, that MacArthur's insistence on liberating every island in the archipelago, rather than bypassing garrisons that no longer posed a strategic threat, wasted lives to fulfill a personal promise. The argument is still made. The evidence supports it. MacArthur, until the end of his life, defended his strategy. On the 2nd of September 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Chester Nimitz stepped forward to a small table on the veranda deck and signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the United States. Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremonies as Supreme Commander for the Allied powers. William Halsey stood a few paces behind Nimitz. Clifton Sprague was not present. He was still on active duty in the Pacific. Ernest Evans was not present. He was somewhere in the deep waters east of Samar. Chester Nimitz never wrote a memoir. He was asked many times over the 21 years he lived after the war why he did not. His answer was always the same. He did not want to present his own side of the story because he was afraid it might belittle the accomplishments of others. Douglas MacArthur wrote his memoirs at length. He mentioned Clark Field only to blame others. The compromise the two men had made in the summer of 1944, brokered by a dying president in an election year, had nearly cost the United States its greatest naval disaster since Pearl Harbor. And it had at the same moment saved the fleet from becoming the instrument of one man's personal promise. There is no simple lesson in this. There is only what happened. Two commanders who never trusted each other. A president who cared more about the next election than the next battle. A Japanese admiral who found the seam and drove for it. And a handful of American sailors in ships never meant to fight who stood in the way at dawn on a gray morning off Samar and bought the time that should never have needed to be bought. The world wonders still